I thought my parents had erased me forever, even filing a death certificate with my name when I was only 14. Years later, I was living under a bridge with my niece, convinced the world had forgotten us, when a black car stopped in the dark. Inside was the face I had seen only in one faded photo, my grandfather. He was alive, he was a billionaire, and he had come to take us back. What he told me about my parents that night shattered every lie I had been forced to believe. Snow drifted down through the cracks of the overpass and melted as soon as it touched the thin blanket wrapped around Lily and me. I held her close, her small body pressed against my chest, trying to give her every bit of warmth I had left. She was too young to know what it truly meant to be abandoned, but the way her shoulders shook told me she understood more than she should. The air under the bridge smelled of damp concrete and exhaust. My legs were stiff from sitting on the cardboard we had dragged here earlier, and my hands were numb, but I kept stroking Lily's hair, hoping the motion would soothe her. She stirred and whispered against my shirt. "Aunt Clara, will we have dinner tomorrow?" I tightened the blanket around her and kissed the top of her head. "Yes, baby, I'll find something." The words came out steady, though my stomach had been empty since morning. I had once believed that promises meant safety. Years ago, my parents told me family would never let me go. That was before they chose someone else to carry the family name and left me behind. I touched the silver locket that hung at my neck, the only thing I had kept from that house. Inside were my initials scratched by a child's hand. Every time I felt its edge, I remembered the night I realized I was on my own. I was 14, standing on the porch, and my mother's eyes slid right past me as if I had never belonged. That memory stayed with me sharper than hunger. A siren wailed from downtown Denver, echoing under the bridge. I pulled Lily tighter. Her breath rose in faint clouds, soft against my skin. "Don't be scared," I murmured, though it was me who fought the fear clawing at my ribs. I thought about the diner jobs I had lost, the cleaning shifts that dried up the endless search for a safe place to sleep. Each step down had brought me here. I told myself I could endure as long as Lily did not have to see me break. Headlights cut across the dark, too bright to ignore. A black sedan slowed and rolled to a stop on the gravel near us. My heart thudded. People did not come here unless they wanted trouble. The engine shut off. A car door opened with a heavy click. I grabbed the strap of my worn backpack, ready to run if I had to. Footsteps approached, firm and unhurried. Then a man's voice carried in the cold. "Clara." My chest tightened. No one had said my name like that in years. He stepped into the pale beam of light. An older man, tall, wrapped in a dark wool coat. His hair was silver, his face marked by time, but his eyes were sharp, fixed on me, as though he had finally found what he had been searching for. "That locket," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. "I gave it to you when you were 5. My hand flew to the pendant at my throat. Every instinct screamed that I should deny him, grab Lily, and vanish into the shadows. But his gaze held me still. Lily blinked awake, rubbing her eyes. "Who is he?" she whispered. The man stepped closer, careful, his breath visible in the freezing air. "My name is Edward Monroe. I am your grandfather, and I have been looking for you for years." The silence that followed was heavier than the snow. My pulse raced, torn between disbelief and the sudden fear that my life, the one I had pieced together from scraps, was about to be ripped open again. I did not know whether to trust him or run, but I knew nothing would ever be the same after this moment. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled something from his coat pocket, a worn photograph folded at the edges. He held it toward me, the paper fluttering in the cold air. I hesitated before reaching out. The picture showed a little girl on a swing set, dark hair tied in uneven pigtails, a silver locket glinting at her neck. Standing behind her was a younger version of the man in front of me. My throat tightened. I remembered that day, the scent of cut grass, the thrill of swinging high enough to feel my stomach drop. My mother had snatched the photo from me years later, saying we did not need reminders of the past. Yet here it was in his hand. Edward's voice was low but steady. "You were born June 15th, 1996, at Denver General Hospital, 7 pounds 1 ounce. You had a small birthmark behind your left knee." I froze. No one outside my parents could have known those details. He did not sound like a stranger. He sounded like a man carrying pieces of me I thought had been erased. Still, I pulled Lily closer. Why are you here now? Why not years ago? Pain flickered across his face. Because I was kept from you, and I will explain everything. But not here. You cannot stay under this bridge another night. Let me take you both to my home. The warmth of his words collided with the ice of my doubt. The idea of stepping into a car with him felt reckless, yet the thought of another night out here with Lily's lips turning blue was worse. I studied him, searching for deception, and all I saw was exhaustion carved into his lined features. Lily tugged at my sleeve. Can we go, Aunt Clara? Please, I'm so cold. Her plea cut through the last of my hesitation. I nodded once. Edward's shoulders sagged with relief. He opened the car door and waited as I lifted Lily inside. I slid in beside her, gripping the backpack on my lap like armor. The sedan pulled away its heater, filling the cabin with blessed warmth. Lily curled against me and drifted into sleep. I stayed alert, eyes fixed on Edward, as city lights blurred past the windows. He did not push conversation, only glanced back once, as if to assure himself we were real. An hour later, the car climbed a winding road lined with pines. When the gates of a sprawling estate swung open, my breath caught. The mansion that rose ahead was lit from within every window, glowing against the snow. It looked like something from a world Lily and I had only ever seen in magazines left behind on bus seats. Edward led us through doors tall enough to swallow the bridge whole. The air smelled of cedar and polished marble. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing heat that made my skin sting. Lily's eyes widened as she clutched my hand, staring at chandeliers glittering above. Before I could take it all in, another man approached. He was in his 40s, sharp suit, pressed crisp eyes alert behind wire-rimmed glasses. Edward gestured toward him. This is Daniel Brooks, my attorney and trusted friend. Daniel shook my hand firmly, studying me as though measuring truth in my face. Then he nodded. There is no doubt. Clara Monroe is the rightful heir of Monroe Holdings. We have the documents to prove it. The words landed heavy, almost absurd. Heir, holdings. They felt foreign, like a language I was not meant to speak. I had been invisible under an overpass only hours ago, and now a stranger in a mansion told me I belonged to an empire. My heart pounded. Why would you say that? My parents. The words slipped out before I could stop it. I had not spoken of them in years, not aloud. Edward's expression hardened, sorrow mingling with anger. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. Your parents did something unforgivable, Clara, something you deserve to know. Tonight in this house you will hear the truth. The fire snapped in the hearth shadows, shifting across the marble floor. I felt the ground tilt beneath me, the heat pressing against my skin. My chest tightened as if bracing for a blow I could not yet see. Whatever he was about to reveal would tear open wounds I had buried deep, and I could no longer escape it. Edward led me into a smaller study off the main hall, the kind of room built for secrets. Dark wood lined the walls, shelves heavy with leather-bound books, and the faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air. He motioned for me to sit, but I stayed standing, my hands clenched at my sides. Lily had been taken upstairs by a housekeeper, her eyes wide with excitement at the idea of a warm bed. I envied her innocence. Edward opened a drawer in his desk and set down a thin folder. His voice was steady, but low. Clara, your parents. Richard and Margaret wanted you erased, not just from their lives, but from the family records. In 2010, they filed a false death certificate in Denver County. According to the state of Colorado, you died that year. The words knocked the air from my lungs. I shook my head, unable to process what I was hearing. That's impossible. Someone would have stopped them. They had help, Edward said, sliding a page across the desk. It was a copy of the certificate, my name typed in black ink, date of death, listed at 14 years old. My throat burned as I stared at it. Your parents paid Susan Carter, their attorney at the time, to push it through. She signed off on every forged document. She was well compensated to make sure no questions were asked. I pressed my palms against the edge of the desk, needing something solid beneath me. Why would they do this to me? His eyes darkened. Because they wanted everything to go to Emily. They believed she was their legacy, the daughter worthy of carrying the family forward. Removing you secured her inheritance without challenge. I let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. So I was nothing. Just a problem to erase. Edward came around the desk, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. You were never nothing. You were my granddaughter, and I never stopped searching. The only reason they succeeded was because they kept me in the dark. The weight of his words pressed hard against my chest. Images of my mother's cold smile and my father's silence flooded back. All the years of wondering why they never reached for me had an answer now. They had chosen not to. Edward walked to a wall safe behind a painting and keyed in a code. The heavy door opened with a groan. From inside, he pulled a thick envelope and a leather binder. He carried them to the desk and opened the binder, revealing a will dated 2018. This is my estate plan, he said. In it, you are named as beneficiary. But more importantly, you are registered as a co-founder in Monroe Holdings, the company I built. It gives you authority to countersign major decisions. If someone wants to move millions or alter the direction of the company, they need your approval. The words seemed unreal. Only hours earlier, I had been counting coins for dinner, and now this man told me I had the power to shape an empire. Edward pushed the binder closer to me. I wanted to be sure that if anything happened to me, you would not be silenced again. I ran my hand over the thick paper, my fingers trembling. The ink blurred as tears filled my eyes. I could hardly breathe under the weight of it. Daniel Brooks stepped into the room quietly, holding another file. Everything he says is true. I reviewed the records myself. The false documents can be overturned. But you need to understand, Clara, this will put you against your parents in a way you cannot step back from. My knees weakened, and I sank into the leather chair. My mind raced with memories of birthdays, forgotten graduations, ignored nights. I cried myself to sleep, wondering what I had done wrong. Now I knew it was not neglect. It was betrayal, deliberate and cold. I pressed my face into my hands. The sob tore out before I could stop it. Edward knelt beside me, his voice quiet but certain. You are not alone anymore. You hold the proof in your hands. The fire in the hearth crackled, filling the silence that followed. I lifted my head slowly, eyes burning but fierce. I wanted to scream, to tear down the walls with the truth, but all I could do was clutch the will against my chest. For the first time in years, I did not feel invisible. I felt like a weapon sharpened by pain. And somewhere upstairs, my parents had no idea that the daughter they tried to erase was about to rise against them. Morning light spilled across the snow-capped mountains outside the tall windows when the first phone calls came. Edward had warned me the news would not stay quiet for long, but I still felt my stomach drop when I saw the headline on the tablet, a housekeeper left on the counter. Heiress found under Denver Bridge. My picture, snapped without me knowing, was already plastered across half a dozen outlets. Lily was upstairs eating pancakes like nothing had changed, but my hands shook as I scrolled. By noon, black SUVs crunched over the gravel drive. I knew before the butler announced them who it would be. My mother stepped into the marble foyer, first pearls at her throat, her posture rigid with practiced grace. Behind her came my father, face tight, silent as ever. Emily followed last, her designer coat swinging as she walked, lips curved into a smirk that never reached her eyes. The air felt heavy, charged. I stood at the base of the staircase, forcing myself to meet them head-on. My mother's eyes swept over me with a mixture of disdain and false relief. So it's true, she said, her voice polished but sharp. You've let him drag you back into this house. I clenched my fists. Why did you do it? Why did you erase me? Her smile was thin, cold. Because Emily was the future. You were always too quiet, too soft. We could not risk the company on someone like you. My father shifted his weight but said nothing. His silence was more cutting than her words. Emily tilted her head, her tone dripping with superiority. You should be grateful we let you go. Look at you now, dragged back only because Grandpa feels guilty. Do you really think you belong here? Heat flared in my chest. I took a step forward, my voice shaking with fury. I belonged from the beginning. You stole my life and handed it to her." My mother's mask cracked for a moment, irritation flashing in her eyes. "You think anyone will believe a girl who was living under a bridge? You have no job, no stability, no future. And you dare to claim responsibility for a child? We will not allow it." Her words hit like ice. She was not only denying me but threatening to rip Lily away. I felt my whole body stiffen. Emily crossed her arms. "Face it, Clara. You are unfit. The courts will see it, the press will see it. Lily deserves better than a homeless guardian clinging to a charity handout." I wanted to scream, but instead I forced my voice low and steady. "You are not taking her from me." My mother raised her chin. "We will bring this to court. We will prove you cannot provide. You will lose her, and you will lose everything else." The foyer went still. My father finally spoke, his voice flat. "It is the only way to protect the family." I stared at them, feeling the ground tilt beneath me, the rage boiling higher with every word they spoke. Edward stepped into the room, then his cane tapping softly against the marble. His eyes swept across them with contempt. "You will not threaten her here," he said firmly. My mother's smile returned brittle and false. "We are only stating facts." I turned to Edward, then back to them, and in that moment a resolve I had never known hardened inside me. They thought I was weak, disposable, unfit. They had forgotten I now carried the one thing they could never undo: proof. My voice cut through the silence. "You tried to erase me once. This time I will fight you, and I will use every law and every truth you buried to bring you down." My mother's eyes narrowed. Emily scoffed. My father looked away, but I did not flinch. My pulse thundered, not with fear but with certainty. The sound of my own words echoed through the grand hall, and I knew this was only the beginning. The battle would move beyond these walls into courtrooms and headlines, and there would be no turning back. The courthouse in downtown Denver loomed above me, its stone columns streaked with years of weather and judgment. I clutched Lily's hand as Daniel Brooks guided us up the steps, his briefcase swinging steadily at his side. Reporters shouted my name from behind barricades, cameras flashing, but Daniel kept his voice low and even. "Do not look at them. Focus straight ahead. Today we prove you exist in the eyes of the law, not just in blood." Inside, the air was sharp with polish and paper. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, called the emergency hearing to order. My parents sat at the opposite table, Margaret in her pearls, Richard staring down at the desk, and Emily with her phone hidden in her lap, like this was just another stage to pose on. Daniel stood first, laying out the evidence in a calm rhythm. He placed the forged death certificate on the screen, its seal glinting under the courtroom lights. According to this record, my client Clara Monroe was declared dead in 2010 at the age of 14. Yet she stands here alive. The filing was not an error. It was fraud orchestrated by Richard and Margaret Hale, with the assistance of their attorney Susan Carter. Gasps rustled through the benches. I forced myself to look straight at the judge, not at my mother's cold profile or my father's stone silence. Margaret's lawyer rose, arguing that it was all a misunderstanding, a clerical error, nothing more. The judge narrowed her eyes. "A clerical error does not involve a death certificate signed by an attorney of record." Daniel opened his briefcase again. "Your Honor, we also submit these." He handed over a printed chain of emails. The screen behind him lit with the text. "Payments wired to Susan Carter," subject lines that read, "Final confirmation of file." Margaret stiffened. Emily's smirk faltered, and for the first time, Richard's hand twitched nervously on the table. Susan Carter herself sat 2 rows back. Her face flushed as the judge scanned the emails, lips pressed in a thin line. "This is damning," the judge said flatly. My heart hammered in my chest. For years I thought I had no proof, no voice. Now the lies were spilling into the open, every page, a piece of the cage they built for me. Edward rose slowly with Daniel's help, his cane tapping once against the floor. His voice carried calm but thunderous in its truth. "Your Honor, the will I executed in 2018 names Clara Monroe as beneficiary and co-founder of Monroe Holdings. It includes a clause known as no contest. Any heir who challenges without valid cause forfeits their rights completely. The words sliced the room in half. Margaret's lawyer sputtered. Emily leaned forward in alarm, and my father's face went pale. The judge looked down from the bench. Do the Hales wish to continue their claim in light of this clause? For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was louder than the cameras outside. Daniel pressed the advantage. Your Honor, we request immediate recognition of Clara Monroe's guardianship of Lily Monroe and temporary control of her inheritance until the full case is resolved. My client cannot be left vulnerable another day. I held my breath as the judge tapped her pen against the desk. Finally, she spoke. The evidence of fraud is overwhelming. This court grants emergency guardianship of Lily Monroe to her aunt Clara Monroe. Furthermore, Clara is granted temporary authority under the 2018 will as co-founder of Monroe Holdings until a formal trial is held. The gavel cracked once. My knees almost gave out. Margaret's face blanched. Emily muttered something venomous under her breath, and Richard slumped as though the air had been drained from him. The mask of control they had worn for years was slipping right there under the fluorescent lights of a courtroom. Lily squeezed my hand tightly, looking up at me with wide eyes. Does this mean we are safe now? She whispered. I bent down, my voice trembling with a mix of relief and fury. It means they cannot erase us anymore. But as we left the courtroom with reporters pressing against the doors, I caught the look on my mother's face. It was not defeat. It was calculation. And I knew this fight was only beginning. The summons arrived less than a week later, delivered by courier to the Aspen estate while Lily and I were in the garden. Daniel opened it first, his jaw tightening as he scanned the pages. He handed it to me with a calm voice that betrayed the tension in his eyes. My parents had filed for immediate review of my capacity to manage guardianship and financial authority. Their claim was simple and brutal. Clara Monroe, formerly homeless, is unfit to control a multi-billion-dollar corporation and unfit to raise a child. The words blurred for a moment, rage clouding my vision. Edward placed a steady hand on my shoulder. They are desperate. Desperation makes people reckless. We will use that. The hearing was scheduled in Denver District Court. When the day came, I walked into the chamber with Lily's small hand in mine, my other clutching a folder Daniel had prepared. Across the aisle sat Margaret in her polished suit, Richard rigid and silent, Emily whispering into their attorney's ear. Their confidence oozed across the room like oil. The judge called for statements. Their lawyer rose, voice dripping with certainty. Your Honor, my clients contend that Ms. Monroe cannot be entrusted with the financial or personal care responsibilities she currently holds. She has no steady employment record, no history of providing for herself, and has only recently emerged from living on the street. To leave Monroe Holdings and the minor child Lily Monroe in her custody is reckless. I felt Lily's grip tighten. My chest burned, but I stood when Daniel motioned to me. My voice was steady, though each word carried the weight of years unspoken. Your Honor, I have cared for Lily since she was an infant. Every school enrollment form, every medical appointment, every late-night fever, I handled them alone. These are not claims. They are documented. Daniel placed the folder on the bench. Inside were Lily's report cards, attendance records, pediatrician notes, vaccination histories. Each page bore my signature proof that even in the shadows, I had never abandoned her. The judge flipped through the documents slowly. My mother's face stiffened, her pearls suddenly seeming to choke her. Emily glanced nervously at the exhibits, her smirk faltering. Then Daniel cleared his throat. There is another matter the court must consider. In 2018, Edward Monroe executed not only a will, but a co-founder agreement for Monroe Holdings. That document grants Clara Monroe equal voting power on any major corporate decision. It was signed, witnessed, and filed with the company registrar. Gasps moved through the gallery. My parents' attorney jumped to his feet, sputtering objections. This is outrageous. Fabricated. Daniel slid a certified copy across the table. The seal glimmered under the light. Authentic, notarized, and verified. My heart pounded. For the first time, I saw real fear flash across my mother's eyes. Richard's hand trembled against the desk, and Emily whispered furiously to their lawyer. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. So not only did you attempt to erase this woman from her family, but you also misrepresented her legal rights to a company worth billions. And now you claim she is unfit. Margaret's lawyer tried to speak, but the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of her gavel. Enough. I will not entertain further attempts to obscure the truth. She turned her gaze directly on my parents. If you continue to submit falsehoods or challenge these documents without cause, you will forfeit all standing in this court. Margaret's lips pressed tight, fury radiating from her, but she said nothing. Richard kept his eyes on the floor. The ruling came swift. This court affirms Clara Monroe as legal guardian of Lily Monroe. Temporary financial authority remains in her control under the co-founder agreement. Any further fraudulent claims will be sanctioned. The gavel fell, and the sound reverberated like thunder. I felt my knees shake, but this time it was not from fear. It was the rush of power, raw and undeniable. For the first time, I stood not as the forgotten daughter, not as the woman under a bridge, but as a force they could no longer silence. As we stepped out of the courtroom into the flashing lights of the press, Daniel leaned close and whispered, "They will not stop here. Prepare yourself. The next strike will not come in the courtroom. It will come in the open, where the world is watching." Amanda Lee's article hit the Denver Post first, then spread across national outlets within hours. The headline was merciless. Former Monroe heirs accused of fraud and abuse. Pictures of my mother and father leaving the courthouse with cameras flashing covered every screen. By the next morning, commentators were dissecting every line of the forged death certificate, every payment to Susan Carter, every piece of evidence Daniel had unveiled. Emily's face, once plastered across glossy magazines and social media campaigns, vanished from billboards overnight. Brands announced they were suspending contracts. One press release read simply that the company no longer aligned with her values. I watched the news from Edward's study, Lily curled beside me on the leather couch. She asked why Aunt Emily looked so angry on television. I told her some people hate when the truth finally catches up to them. The fallout did not stop there. The Colorado State Bar confirmed an investigation into Susan Carter. A news anchor read her name with measured condemnation, noting that her license was now in jeopardy for fraud and misconduct. I remembered her signature on the death certificate and felt a grim satisfaction knowing that ink would cost her everything. For days the calls came in waves, reporters waiting outside the gates, neighbors whispering. Then one evening, as the snow melted into muddy rivers along the driveway, a black sedan pulled up to the estate. I recognized it immediately. My parents stepped out together, no cameras this time, only the weight of disgrace in their movements. My mother still wore pearls, but they hung awkwardly against her collarbone as if even they knew their shine had dulled. My father's eyes were sunken, his shoulders slumped. Emily was not with them. Edward met them at the door, but they asked for me. Against his advice, I agreed. I wanted to hear what they would say, without the armor of courtrooms or lawyers. We sat in the library where the fire glowed faintly, its warmth unable to thaw the chill between us. My mother spoke first, her voice stripped of its usual polish. "Clara, we made mistakes. We were wrong to sign those papers. But you have to understand we thought we were protecting the family." The word family cracked something inside me. I leaned forward, my voice sharp. "You were protecting yourselves. You erased me, you left me on the street, and you told the world I was dead." My father finally looked up, his lips trembling. "Please, if you push this further, we lose everything. The house, the accounts, the legacy. There must be something left for us." I almost laughed. "Now you want mercy. Where was that mercy when I begged for help with Lily, when I showed up at your door and you closed it in my face?" My mother's hands twisted in her lap. "We were wrong, but you can still stop this. We will step back from the company. Just leave us enough to live. You have power now. Use it kindly." I stood my chair, scraping the floor. "You chose to erase me. Now it is justice that erases you. I will not save you from the consequences you created. The words hung in the air like a sentence passed. My father's shoulders sagged. My mother's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. They left without another word, their footsteps echoing down the marble hall like ghosts retreating into the dark. That night, Amanda Lee's latest piece went live. It showed side-by-side photographs of Margaret and Richard Hale, once celebrated benefactors of Denver's high society, now leaving my grandfather's estate with faces pale and drawn. The caption read simply, "From power to exile." The next morning, the silence around them was louder than any scandal. Calls were not returned, invitations vanished, friends distanced themselves. Margaret and Richard Hale had spent decades building a kingdom of appearances. Now the walls were gone, and all that remained was the hollow echo of their own lies. I watched from the window as reporters moved on as the gates closed quietly against the world. Inside, I felt something shift. The fight was not finished, but for the first time, I understood that the ground beneath me had changed forever. The boardroom at Monroe Holdings was brighter than I imagined, a wall of glass windows framing the Denver skyline. I sat at the head of the long table, papers spread in front of me, Daniel to my right, and Edward across from me, with quiet pride in his eyes. The vote had just ended. Every seat around the table had turned in my favor. My name was written into the record as co-founder and heir. It felt unreal, the kind of moment I once thought only belonged to other people. But power was not what I wanted. What mattered was what I could do with it. That night I walked through the estate, listening to Lily's laughter echo down the hall. She had discovered her own room with walls painted pale yellow, and a bed piled with blankets so soft she buried herself in them. Her voice carried down the corridor. "Aunt Clara, is this really mine? Forever?" I knelt beside her bed and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. "Yes, it's yours. You never have to wonder where you'll sleep again." Her eyes closed with a smile, and I kissed her forehead, my chest tightening with gratitude and sorrow all at once. In the weeks that followed, I began the work. With Edward's blessing, I established the Under the Bridge Foundation. The first mission was simple: provide housing and resources for families like mine, people who had fallen through the cracks, children left to survive in shadows. I visited shelters in Denver, sat with mothers who held their kids close under threadbare coats, and I remembered every night Lily and I had done the same. Reporters gathered when we announced the foundation. They wanted statements about my parents' downfall, about Emily's vanished career, about Susan Carter's investigation. I refused to linger on their ruin. Instead, I spoke of the children I had seen huddled under bridges, of the people who needed a voice. The cameras clicked, the microphones leaned closer, but for once the attention did not sting. It felt like purpose. One evening after the press conference, Edward joined me on the terrace. The mountains were dusted with late snow, the sky fading to violet. He set his hand on mine. "You turned pain into something bigger than revenge, Clara. That is what this family should have been from the start." I swallowed hard, watching Lily chase fireflies in the garden below. I still hear their voices, sometimes telling me I was nothing. Edward shook his head gently. "Look around you. Does this look like nothing?" I breathed deeply, letting the mountain air fill my lungs. For the first time in years, the weight in my chest lifted, not because the scars were gone, but because I finally understood they did not define me. The next day I stood before the cameras again, the foundation's banner behind me, Lily at my side holding my hand. The reporters asked what I wanted people to take from my story. I looked into the lights, feeling every scar, every night under the bridge, every courtroom battle, and I answered, "If it were you, and you learned the most painful truth about your own parents, would you forgive them, or would you let justice speak for you?" The silence that followed was heavy charged, and I knew the question was no longer mine alone.